Stanton asked, "What are wealth and jewels, home and ease, sires and sons to the birthright of freedom, secured to us by the heroes of the Revolution? Shall a priceless heritage like this be wrested now from us by Southern tyrants? No. The vacant places at our firesides, the void in every heart says no. Such sacrifices must not be in vain. The cloud that hangs over all northern homes is gilded with the hope that through these present sufferings the nation shall be redeemed." Right, so Stanton here is talking about women's participation as a participation that is primarily sacrifice, but she's linking that sacrifice to maintaining those ideals of the Revolutionary War. Right? As historian Nina Silber has noted, the primary role that women could play in the public war effort during the Civil War came from their very private sacrifice of husbands, sons, and brothers to the front. A letter from Boston's Mrs. A.C. Hinckley gives us some indication into how these appeals for sacrifice and wartime recruits affected both whose loved ones enlisted and those who were not personally affected by the calls. And Mrs. Hinckley writes to her son, who is presumably away at school at the time. And she notes that we have distress and suffering on every side here. Mothers and sisters haunting the neighboring towns and the state and common for their sons and brothers who have enlisted by stealth and gone away or are preparing. I find this letter interesting because it points to large numbers of young men who enlisted against their mothers' or their families' will. So perhaps those patriotic appeals were not quite as convincing as they might have been. Hinckley herself even appears fairly sort of unaffected by the call for sacrifice. And she writes to her son, "I am so glad that you are not here, for I am afraid you would catch the fever." Presumably the fever that Hinckley is discussing is war. Of course, mothers are probably never truly willing to sacrifice their sons to war, but many young men were eager to enlist in the early stages of the war, partly because in Massachusetts and across the nation as a whole, the war began with a lot of bluster and a variety of wagers on just how short and just how little blood would be spilled in the conflict. South Carolina Senator James Chestnut, who's the husband of famous diarist Mary Boykin Chestnut, famously pledged to drink every drop of blood spilled as a result of secession. Another South Carolina, I believe it was South Carolina, congressperson promised he would eat every body that died as a result of secession. Of course, the war quickly proved exactly how brutal, deadly, and prolonged it would be. Things looked especially bleak for the Union, and I have my sort of very general early battlefield map here. Time and again at places like Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, vastly outnumbered Confederate forces managed to outmaneuver and outpower the Union Army. Even Union victories, such as the Battle of Antietam in 1862, resulted in devastating losses. In fact, Antietam, with its estimated 22,717 casualties, of which almost 4,000 were killed, amounted to the single bloodiest day in American military history. Right? In the face of this series of disastrous Union defeats across the Eastern Front of the war, Northern morale collapsed fairly quickly. Andover soldier Chauncey Thurston wrote early in 1862 to his mother, and he said, "Our men have been slaughtered very badly in most of the late battles, and it all amounts to nothing, comparatively speaking, or worse than nothing. There has not been any time since the rebellion commenced, in my opinion, when things looked so much like the rebels gaining their independence as at the present time." At home, family members with loved ones on the front, like Maria Berry of Lynn, wondered why the war was not over. She wrote to her son on the front, "This rebellion ought to have been put down long before this time. Why God permits it to continue so long, I cannot tell." As was the case for all those with loved ones on the front, Maria Berry's concern for the Union cause in general quickly turned to concern for her son's well-being on the front. And she wrote, "If you are called to go," and he hadn't yet seen any sort of active engagement yet, so she said that's what she's writing about. "If you are called to go, do your duty, my darling son, and may he that never sleepeth nor slumbereth guard and protect you and your friends, cover your head on the day of battle, and shield you in his everlasting arms, and bring you in safety to us again." As is the case with all mothers, Berry couldn't resist sending one more reminder to her son. This kills me. "Now, honey, you have promised me never to smoke or touch or taste ardent spirits of any kind, and if you forget me, you forget your God." So apparently motherly guilt trips have a pretty long history in American culture. Maria Berry was as concerned with her son's morality as she was with the progress of the Union cause, but that fact still remains that the Union Army in 1861 and 1862 was suffering numerous and costly defeats. And in looking for an answer as to why the seemingly outmatched Confederacy was able to best the Union in so many different engagements, Northerners didn't cite the military genius of Robert E. Lee or the fighting skills of Southern men. Of course they're not going to, right? That would never have been the answer that they would come to. So what then might be the reason for this Confederate victory? Just as they're not going to turn to sort of Southern valor as an answer, they're also not going to turn to sort of Northern military weakness as an answer. So who is left? Right? Southern women and their famous patriotism and support for the cause became the chief reason in Northern minds why the South was winning the war in those early periods, right? Even in the early days of the war, Southern women's patriotism was legendary, and we can all sort of think Scarlett O'Hara, right? As we get this image in our head. In their fanatical devotion to the cause, many Southern women abandoned the boundaries of proper female behavior. And historians Stephanie McCurry and Drew Gilpin Fost have neatly cataloged some of the most sort of egregious examples of the types of behavior that prompted one Union general to refer to Confederate women as she-devils. One woman I think she was in North Carolina, told soldiers camped nearby her home that they were welcome to 6 feet of Southern land, but nothing else. Right? You can get what she might mean there. Similarly, a soldier in Tennessee reported that a young woman shouted at him and his fellow soldiers that if it were in her power, she would kill us everyone right there. Right? As McCurry notes, that kind of talk would land a Southern man in jail, right? Confederate women, however, did more than just talk, and you might be able to see some of that on the image that's up there. In areas of Georgia and in the French Quarter of New Orleans, ladies made it a habit to stand on their balconies and empty their chamber pots on the heads of passing Union soldiers. In New Orleans, Admiral Farragut was famously hit while in full dress uniform. Right? In New Orleans, women adopted an additional habit of spitting in the faces of passing Union soldiers. And New Orleans, of course, falls fairly early in the war, and so the Union is there for quite a lot of the war. And that's the image you see here, this woman with sort of wonderful aim. Noting the disjuncture between this act and appropriate female behavior, one Union general called it unsexing. And he commented that, "I look at them, the women, and I think of fallen angels." Right? In fact, this tendency, and not just the sort of physical spitting, but this overall sort of pattern of behavior and just defiance that Southern women demonstrated with Union soldiers, particularly in New Orleans, prompted General Butler, who was the military commander of New Orleans, to issue his famous General Order Number 28. Right? And this order stipulates that as the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subject to repeated insults from the women calling themselves ladies of New Orleans, in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter, when any female shall, by word, gesture, or movement, insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation. So what's Butler getting at here? Right? In other words, women who behaved this way, right, to the Union Army would be treated like prostitutes. Right? Butler intended his order as a way to force women, the women of New Orleans, to police themselves or be thrown in jail with the other female criminals. Right? And the spirit behind Butler's order is really, if you're not going to act like a lady, we're not going to treat you like a lady, and we'll make you sit in jail alongside the prostitutes. Many Southerners interpreted Butler's order as a license to rape, and it actually causes a pretty big brouhaha throughout the nation, and almost brings the English close to sort of recognizing the Confederacy as a separate nation, but diplomacy is able to take over and stop that from happening. And that's not what Butler intended. It wasn't a sort of license to rape or abuse women. And after the war was after the order was put in place, the women of New Orleans found it a lot easier to hold their tongues and their chamber pots in the presence of Union soldiers. The order actually worked. And you can see that sort of indicated in the second half of this cartoon. This is the ladies of New Orleans before General Butler's proclamation, after General Butler's proclamation. And you can see they're accepting a nice little curtsy bow from the soldier. One of the interesting things about Butler's proclamation is one of the groups that is most affected by Butler's proclamation are the enslaved women in New Orleans, enslaved men and women, who are eager to turn in their mistresses for unladylike behavior, and really sort of they're often a lot of the sort of informers that get women thrown in jail. I think they're doing something in the privacy of their own house, not considering the enslaved people who are all around them. Okay. Marblehead soldiers also experienced the zeal of Southern women's patriotism. Our own Pam Peterson includes a story in her book of Captain Richard Phillips of Marblehead, who was marching with his troops through North Carolina, when a defiant Southern lady leaned over her balcony and waved her Confederate flag, an early version of the Confederate flag, right in his face. And as Pam tells the story, Phillips grabbed the flag and carried it home as a war souvenir, and now it's down the street in the GAR Museum here in Marblehead. Right? In spite of this unladylike behavior, Americans in the North and the South truly believed in the early period of the war that Southern women displayed an unwavering devotion to the cause despite the variety of hardships, poverty, starvation, displacement that came with living in a war zone. One New York writer observed in 1863 that but for the courage and energy of the women of the South, we believe the rebellion would not have survived to this time. Right, so these Southern women are getting a lot of credit for the military victories of the Confederacy in the North. It's within this context of sort of seemingly endless examples of rabidly patriotic women in the South that Northerners went looking for a scapegoat to explain their battlefield catastrophes. The Union's historic collapse, to borrow a phrase from the Red Sox a couple years ago, on the battlefield was not viewed as a result of poor leadership and bad battlefield decisions, as I said. Instead, many Northerners believed it was women's fault. For many observers, the empty hearthsides and that sort of motherly sacrifice that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others referred to in Northern homes paled in comparison to Southern women's war sacrifices. And by extension, the Union struggle would be better served if, quote, the women of the North with like zeal addressed themselves to the work of encouraging a loyal and devoted spirit among us. That writer was just one and a chorus of complaints about the patriotism of Northern women. Another more vocal and influential critic of Northern women was Mary Abigail Dodge, who was an author and columnist who wrote under the name Gail Hamilton. Dodge's pseudonym was derived from her middle name and the town where she lived, Hamilton, Massachusetts. Hamilton wrote several times about the problem of Northern patriotism. And she chastised the, quote, able-bodied men and women who have not as yet made a single sacrifice of personal comfort for the war, who have never for one single moment gone cold or hungry or thirsty for country's sake. Hamilton specifically addressed women in a separate essay, saying, "The issue of this war depends quite as much upon American women as upon American men. It is to them I speak. Let us tear up our carpets to make blankets for the soldiers, as rebels have done. Let us turn our houses and churches into hospitals. Let us confine ourselves to 2 meals a day." For Hamilton, the only measure of patriotism, right, was sacrifice, not just sacrifice of one's loved ones to the front, but sacrifice of one's entire sort of home and comfort to the future of the war, right? If that's your sort of barometer for patriotism, Northern women are never going to be able to compare to Southern women during the Civil War, for the simple reason that the war is not fought in the North, and civilians in the North, with the exception of those in Gettysburg, didn't experience the same privations as those in the South. Right? As a matter of fact, Northern manufacturing and engineering expanded its output during the Civil War, producing enough goods and food to adequately supply both the civilian and military population of the North. So why turn your carpets into blankets when the textile factory is across town, right? Why make the church into a hospital when the front is 800 miles away? The question then for Northern women is, how do we demonstrate our patriotism and aid the war effort when the war is so far from home? And how do we do this while staying within the boundaries of proper female behavior? Northern women didn't really want to be those Southern women spitting at soldiers. And so we want to keep in mind, it's not as though Gail Hamilton wrote these essays and put out this charge and all Northern women got together and said, well, what do we do about this, right? History is messier than that. And the fact is that from the start, Northern women had been looking for ways to feel more connected to what was going on in the front, right? They wanted to aid the war effort in real and meaningful ways, right? And Northern women had always been enthusiastic supporters of the war. Beverly's Lucy Larcom wrote in 1861, "I have felt a soldier spirit rising within me when I saw the men of my native town armed and going to risk their lives for their country's sake." Still, Hamilton's critique, right, sort of captured a feeling that many shared, the feeling that their work could play a role in saving the Union. Now, luckily, Northern women didn't go ripping their curtains off the walls and tearing up their rugs unnecessarily to aid the war effort. In fact, that's all I could think of when I read that Gail Hamilton quote was Carol Burnett and her curtains. In fact, in determining their response to the war, Northern women drew on a long history of philosophies and activities, right, that were appropriate within the North. So to understand Northern women's roles, we need to look closely at women's pre-war activities in Northern societies. Just like so many, just like so many other aspects of antebellum life, Northern women's and Southern women's gender roles differed considerably in the antebellum period before the war. In the North, much more than in the South, women were idealized throughout the antebellum period as virtuous moral compasses within their households, right? From the early Republic on, the ideal Northern woman was a moderating influence on her husband and a moral example for her children, Right? Perhaps more than anything else, Northern women were charged with raising virtuous citizens and teaching Republican, sort of small r Republican values to their sons. Right? This charge for Northern women was known as Republican motherhood, and it was neatly articulated by one speaker who said, "While women thus keep our country virtuous, you maintain its independence." Right? So since the early republic, women had been playing within their private households, right, a very important sort of civic role of raising their young sons to be good citizens and their young daughters to be good Republican mothers themselves. And over the course of the 19th century, Northern women's influence grew beyond her own home as she began to serve as an example to the poor, to the orphaned, to the intemperate, or to the religiously lapsed. Right? In particular, across the North, women became involved in reform work such as temperance societies and Bible societies throughout the 19th century. Right? So I'm the virtuous example to my own family within my own home, and then I also step out of my home and I can be a virtuous example to the immigrant population in my community, or to the sort of poor sailors and their wives in my community. Here in Marblehead, the Marblehead Female Humane Society, which I understand is still in existence, was founded in 1816, and that was just such this kind of organization. Like other women's societies, the Marblehead Female Humane Society was tasked with a decidedly moral charge, right, to help the indigent, the sick, and the infirm. The society noted that these people are at our doors. They are set before us by the common parent of mankind as the proper objects of our compassion and benevolent efforts. While their work took place outside the domestic sphere of the home, the Marblehead women firmly located it within their proper sort of religious and moral spheres of influence, right? Saying, to these, the sick and infirm, the Savior particularly directs our attention. So we can see in these years before the war that women are gaining experience, right, as organizers, right? But they're doing this within this sort of socially accepted role, right, of Republican motherhood. In addition to these moral societies, Essex County women would have had considerable experience with female abolitionist societies, and these were widespread across the county from 1830 on. Essex County is actually very well represented in terms of the number of abolitionist societies, both female and male, that existed in the mid-19th century. And this is the certificate of the Lynn Female Anti-Slavery Society that you can see there. With these abolitionist societies, women were even more careful to ground their work in those traditional roles and in their place as repositories of domestic virtue and morality. So the ladies of Lynn Female Anti-Slavery Society made sure of this when they wrote up the minutes of their sort of first annual meeting. And you can see in this quote, right, that they address charges that what they're doing is not in fact moral but political, and they sort of answer those charges saying, "Let us shake off our remaining apathy, and remembering the sacred and blessed injunction of the Lord to undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free, labor in this field with renewed strength, for the harvest truly is great and the faithful laborers yet too few. And listen not to the suggestion, which is so often extended to us, that abolition, is a subject with which women should have nothing to do because it has a political aspect. Its highest and most distinctive aspect is a moral and benevolent one. And in this sphere, it is not denied that women may operate with propriety and efficiency. It is woman's woes that call most loudly for our efforts to free them and their children from the most cruel oppression, from degradation and outrage in every form. When woman's heart is bleeding, shall woman's voice be hushed." Right? And those last two lines are a sort of motto that extended across abolitionist societies and was often paired with that sort of supplicant slave that you see, on their knees. And that's in both Britain and in the United States. But we can see here how women sort of directly locate this within their proper sphere of influence, particularly talking about their aid or their work in anti-slavery as being work to aid the women of slavery and their children, right, as well. So just as Essex County men anxiously answered Lincoln's call for troops, Essex County women organized themselves and drew on this experience organizing themselves into a specific and familiar kind of benevolent work, soldiers' aid societies. Right? The ladies of Haverhill and Bradford met on April 22nd, 1861. That's just 1 week after Fort Sumter, to organize a local aid society. Marblehead's Mary Alley and Mary Graves formed a soldiers' aid society here. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get to the records of the soldiers' aid society in time for the talk, but it's safe to assume that in organizing the Soldiers' Aid Society here in Marblehead, that Alley and Graves and the other Marblehead women drew on their experience with that Marblehead Female Humane Society, right? For example, in 1816, its first year of work, that Marblehead Female Humane Society provided assistance to 48 people here in town. In most cases, the relief that they provided included clothing, wine, sugar, tea, and bed linen. So they're providing sort of some basic necessities. Many of us view wine as a basic necessity. And so organizing for the Soldiers' Aid Societies in 1861 must have been old hat for these Marblehead ladies, because while the individual structure of those societies varied, they all kind of did the same thing. They provided clothing, old cotton and linen for bandages, food, towels, handkerchiefs, and other items to soldiers on the front. So the women of Marblehead could sort of simply transfer some of the benevolent work they were doing for the poor and indigent in town, and instead sort of devote those energies to the soldiers on the front. This was no small task. In just 1 month in 1864, the women of New England sent the following to be distributed among soldiers: 1,836 flannel drawers, 2,017 new cotton drawers, 2,188 flannel shirts, 2,576 new cotton shirts, 1,335 woolen socks. They must mean pairs because that's an odd number. 7,471 handkerchiefs, 1,005 quilts, 1,869 sheets, 1,299 slippers, again an odd number, 5,000... Yeah, that's true. That's true. 5,955 towels, 1,818 pillowcases, 138 canes and crutches, 12 bottles of California brandy, 120 bottles of bay rum, 42 pounds of coffee, 1,032 pounds of dried fruit. We get the idea, and that's just the beginning. Right? So Soldiers' Aid Society then take the sort of traditional work, right, of women's task of feeding and clothing one's family, and the traditional work of that women did in caring for the community's neediest people, and they gave them a national purpose during wartime, right? And so this is a pretty natural fit for women, right? But it's important to remember that while this work drew on women's traditional household roles and their sort of past experience in benevolent societies, it was also very different than their previous benevolent work, right? Aid Society women saw themselves as dedicated participants in the war and not just intermittent volunteers who gave when it was convenient. They recognized that being part of the war effort required a dedication that was absent in previous benevolent organizations, or at least less necessary. The ladies of Haverhill and Bradford used the language of the military to describe their wartime contributions. Writing to a soldier on the front, they said, "Though not beside you in your hour of danger, our hands shall not be idle. The Soldiers' Relief Society has enlisted for the war." Right? That language of enlistment was apt. right? It's how many women saw their work in aiding the war. And it also sort of takes on another sort of additional layer of sort of appropriateness, because these soldiers' aid societies eventually became affiliated with a much larger national bureaucratic entity, the United States Sanitary Commission, right? The United States Sanitary Commission was a national organization that was specifically designed to centralize relief efforts and provide aid to soldiers. So this is an important difference, right, that we see with the Civil War. Whereas before, previous women's benevolent work may have been linked loosely to a larger sort of society or church, right? Soldiers' aid societies now work through their local connections to provision a sort of national entity. Right? So it's removing that sort of local connection. So whereas in many ways, women, when they first came to these soldiers' aid societies, they wanted to do it, they wanted to be a part of it in part because they wanted to make sure that their loved ones on the front had what they needed, right? Like people send care packages to soldiers today. I want to make sure my son has socks and bandages and whatever it might be. Once these soldiers' aid societies get involved with the United States Sanitary Commission, right, it depersonalized those acts of patriotism, making them more a part of a national bureaucracy and less a part of a sort of motherly or womanly instinct, as it were, as it might be, right? As part of the Sanitary Commission, as I said, women's benevolent work truly became part of this national effort. Writing to the ladies of Andover, the New England branch of the Sanitary Commission recognized the group as one of the New England groups of the greatest importance to the good of the country. The letter goes on to stress, quote, "The women of the land have seen and done their share of patriotic duty. The fundamental principle of the Commission, the common brotherhood of all soldiers who suffer, no matter whether from East or West, has approved itself to all hearts and has made the gifts of various sections of the country into one great store, from which none are turned unsatisfied. Truly, we may be proud of such a national commission." Again, the Sanitary Commission is taking women's traditional domestic and benevolent duties and giving them this truly national significance. Many women serve the war through their work in those soldiers' aid societies. Others participate more directly in the war as Army nurses, and they get quite a hat in recognition of that. The enlistment of Northern women as nurses stemmed from that same desire to do something that spurred the creation of those soldiers' aid societies. But nursing is quite different than those soldiers' aid societies at the same time. Nursing required women to have very close contact with men's bodies, men that they didn't know. And so it was, the field was initially deemed unsuitable for women. Right. One woman suggested that soldiers would not want young female nurses and instead would prefer, quote, "some motherly person with a snowy white cap and ample shape." I'm guessing she didn't know men very well, right? Still, just as women justified work in aid societies as a natural extension of their domestic responsibilities, they justified nursing by saying it was part of their traditional role as mothers and caregivers. So you see these same arguments come into play. And women often, they don't only sort of say that this is woman's instinct and woman's role to be a caregiver, but they also use familial terms, right, in talking about the relationships that they have with the different soldiers that they serve as nurses. So they speak of their obligation to their patients, right? And they talk about behaving as surrogates for those soldiers' mothers, sisters, right, etc. For some, that activity offered comfort that a kind nurse would do the same for their wounded loved ones elsewhere. And here it's important to remember, one, the scope of loss throughout the Civil War. Right? We've always worked under the assumption that it's 620,000, 640,000 men who died largely from disease. Scholars are starting to push that up a little bit, with some of the latest estimates coming in closer at 750,000, and that's just the military casualties, not civilian casualties. So almost every family is touched in some way by death in the Civil War, right? And it's a very this is a very sort of new experience for people, right? In the 19th century, the way to die was at home, surrounded by your friends and family, and then you're laid out in the parlor, right, for everybody to come and visit and sort of experience and share in your death, right? That can't happen on the battlefield. And so just on top of all of the normal, grief, right, that comes with the death of a loved one, was this additional layer of family sometimes never knowing exactly what happened or how their family member died, but also thinking about that person being alone without that sort of comfort of family, which was so much an important part of especially the 19th century sort of Victorian experience of dying, as it were, right? Victorians like to talk about these moments and when they imagine the good death, right, as they talked about it, was a death surrounded by family and friends, where you knew that you were dying and you were able to make peace. And family members don't know if any of that happened on the front. And the young men who are in battle, right, are also concerned that they're not going to be able to sort of die a good death on the battlefield. And so this role that women played as kind of surrogates, you'd often find them writing letters back, right? And they'd say, oh, he died with a picture of his family. He had made peace with the Lord, and I'm sure he was going to heaven, trying to give their family a sort of second-hand way to experience that death. So whereas that's part of how women justify this sort of work as nurses, right? It's also a very important piece of their work as nurses is also a very important piece in helping sort of both the civilian and military populations kind of deal with the way that dying in war is so different than any of them had ever imagined dying. If that makes sense, right? And so, so women act this way in the hope that someone is doing the same for their loved one elsewhere. And in other ways, this familial role justified the close contact between women and strange men, right? Hannah Stevenson wrote a letter. She's from Boston, I believe. She wrote a letter demonstrating this sort of aspect of nursing. And she wrote of Jesse Eggleston, whom they call my baby, a long, lank, honest, modest boy of 18 from Geneva, who wept because he feared that the socks his mother knit for him had been lost, and looked so happy today when I touched his dry lips with the first peach we have seen. Right? From this example, we can see that both soldiers and nurses recognized, right, the relationship that characterized their interactions in the Army hospital. Far from home and in the midst of a devastating war, nurses provided comfort, right, and their interactions with the soldiers really provided comfort to both parties, right? And even though women used the language of female domesticity to become nurses, that field was anything but domestic, right? That the work of the soldiers' aid societies, it would happen in your own home, right? Or perhaps in the local church where you might meet with the other ladies and have a sewing circle. It takes place within this feminine sphere and within the northern household. But nursing happens in the hyper-masculine environment of the battlefield. Right? 20,000 women served as military technicians of some sort in the Union Army. So that went from everything to, surgical nurses that we might think of, to people who are cleaning around the hospitals. Even more than the soldiers' aid societies, nursing brought women into national relationships. This time not with the Sanitary Commission, but with the state and with the military. So nurses are living far from home, many of them for the first time. Many of them are young women. They're living in military housing and tents. They were interacting with surgeons, they were interacting with politicians, and they were interacting with the average soldier on a daily basis. Right? In this atmosphere, women began to view themselves as part of the army. Right? Complaining of the ineptitude and the dishonesty of army officers, one woman wrote, "The army is an awful school in some respects, and few men have the self-control to use power well." But later in that same letter, she noted, "The work is immensely hard, but I get used to it. If we could do it as citizens instead of soldiers, it would be easy." Right? And here she's sort of lumping herself in with the soldiers on the front. I would be remiss in giving this talk if I didn't explicitly mention the work of Northern African American women during the Civil War. Many African American women did not enjoy the middle class status that gave the white women that we've been talking about here the time to participate wholeheartedly in these specific aspects of the war effort. But still, there's a large black population here in the North that took part in the types of work and the sacrifice that we have discussed here today. Their participation in the war effort, like their benevolent work in the years before the war, because these African American women who have also been involved in some benevolent societies, largely took place in segregated societies. Right? So even though the North isn't free, or is free, that doesn't mean it's a bastion of equality and opportunity. Right? And so often, as a matter of fact, many of the abolitionist societies that exist in the early 19th century are actually segregated societies. The example of Charlotte Forten highlights one aspect of the war effort that was particularly meaningful to Northern African Americans. And Charlotte Forten is a fascinating local figure. She was born in Philadelphia to a family of very prominent sailmakers, and her family sent her to Salem to attend Salem Normal School, now Salem State University, because it was an integrated school and she could get an education there. And so Forten is living in Massachusetts for several years before the war breaks out. And she becomes one woman to take place in efforts to sort of almost missionary kind of efforts to the newly freed people across the South. As a tide of war turned in 1863, and more Southern lands with their thousands of newly freed people came under Union control, the federal government began to answer the question of how to make freedom meaningful for the former enslaved population. Right? From 1863 onward, the Union Army is really an army of liberation as it moves throughout the South, freeing enslaved people sort of in its wake. What does freedom mean? Right? In this context, how do you take a group of people who have had nothing, right, and make freedom something that they are able to enjoy, right? And one of the big answers to that question is by providing them with education, right? Education was the sort of northern answer as to what is one of the first things that freed people need, right? And it was also what a lot of the freed people themselves wanted. And all across the South, right, there are aid societies that are that get sent down, and it's usually abolitionist groups from the North that form these Freedmen's Aid Societies. And they send about 1,000 teachers down south to plant schools even during the war, and about 2,000 teachers in the years after the war who start these sort of freed schools. Many of those teachers commented on the former slaves' desire to learn. And one person said, Negroes in uniforms, Negroes in rags, Negroes in framed houses, Negroes living on the bare ground with the sky for their covering, all hopeful, everyone pleading to be taught, willing to do anything for learning. They are never out of their rooms, and their cry is for books, books, and when will school begin? Freedmen's education was predominantly a New England enterprise. It's mostly New Englanders that are heading down in order to teach the freed people. And that's partly because the public school system is rises early in New England and people are well educated here. It's also because, New Englanders are sort of, what I want to say, have enough ego to assume that they should be the ones heading down to the South and teaching these freed people what they need to know. And they conceived his education as much more than the 3 R's. It's much more than reading, writing, right? What New Englanders want to do when they go down South is implant the values of that Protestant work ethic and free labor ideology that was so prevalent here in the North. They wanted to mold the freed slaves population, freed slaves, in the North's image of industry, economy, and thrift. Right? So they sort of wanted to be the first ones to have an influence on this newly freed population. It's in the midst of the war that Charlotte Fortin in 1862 travels to the Sea Islands of South Carolina, and she starts to instruct the freed people there. And she stayed for 18 months and then she had to leave because she had always been in frail health, and I think it was maybe typhoid or scarlet fever or something that she came down with while she was there. While in the Sea Islands, Fortin instructed her black students in traditional school subjects, and all across the South, these women, both white and black women who are heading down to the South, comment on the fact that they have in their classrooms 4-year-olds and 84-year-olds who all just sort of want to learn. And Fortin instructs her kids in the sort of traditional school subjects, right? And she sees this as the real hope for them. The long, dark night of the past with all its sorrows and its fears was forgotten. And for the future, the eyes of these freed children see no clouds in it. It is full of sunlight. They think and they trust in it perfectly, right? Now that they have access to education. Unlike Northern white women, though, who would serve in the same role, Fortin also wants to instill a sense of pride in her students as African Americans, right? And she wrote in her diary, Thursday, November 13, 1862, "Talk to the children a little while today about the noble Toussaint Louverture, of course the hero of the Haitian Revolution. They listened very attentively. It is well that they should know what one of their own color could do for his race. I long to inspire them with courage and ambition of a noble sort and high purpose." Right? I use Fortin as an example because she's a very interesting woman, and she's local of some of what these freed schools were doing. This is both black and white women who are taking part in these, and African American women, like I said, were also taking part in those more traditional soldiers' aid societies and other things as well. So as members of soldiers' aid societies, nurses, and teachers, Northern women embraced their work to aid the war effort. Initially accused of being unpatriotic and charged with the task of finding a feminine way to aid the war effort, their dedication continued throughout the war and often extended into active participation in organizations that would commemorate the war after the conflict ended. By the end of the war, it was Union women's patriotism that was legendary. An 1867 book that's here at the museum entitled Women of the War, Heroism and Self-Sacrifice gives us some insight into the ways in which Northern women's work in the Civil War both conformed to and expanded traditional notions of women's sphere, right? Speaking of the military and domestic aspects of the war in comparable terms. So the author is sort of really talking about these as equal. The book notes, 20 millions of people divided themselves into 2 grand classes at the outset of the war. Those who shouldered the musket and marched to fight the great battles of the issue, and those who, by reason of their age or sex, or those immediately dependent on their industry, could not fight, but who commenced at once to do all in their power to provide for, to sustain, to cheer, to encourage the soldiers in active service. So again, sort of linking pretty explicitly these 2 halves of the war effort, right? There's the men on the battlefield, and then there's the women's war efforts at home. This author goes on to favorably compare women's willingness to sacrifice to men's. And he argues that men's volunteerism fell off after the first year of the war. But, quote, the liberality and self-sacrifices of the loyal women of the North continually increased, so that after the rage and desolation of 3 years of warfare, it was easy to raise $100,000 for the soldiers, as it had been to collect $10,000 for the same objects in 1861. Excuse me. So what of our Southern women? As the tide of war turned, again following that Battle of Gettysburg, the South experienced horrible losses, both on the battlefield and on the home front. And Southern women's patriotism plummeted. In the summer of 1863, one woman exclaimed, "Oh, how I do pray this war was at an end. If the Yankees are going to whip us, I wish they would hurry up about it." As the prospect of a Confederate victory became ever more remote, women began trying to withhold their loved ones from service and actively encouraged men to desert. One Confederate official, considering the numbers of Confederate deserters, noted, "Desertion takes place because desertion is encouraged. And though the ladies may not be willing to concede the fact, they are nevertheless responsible for the desertion in the army and dissipation of the country." Right? So here we're holding our Southern ladies. I don't know that this lady did anything in particular. She just fit my bill. Right? Particularly responsible not only for battlefield losses, as Northern women had been in the early parts of the war, but for the entire sort of, dissolution of the Confederate cause. Ironically, or perhaps predictably, right, those same Southern women who put Northern women to shame and demonstrated all of the ways in which Northern women's lackluster patriotism led to military failure at the outset of the war, were now the scapegoats of Southern military defeat. In many minds, the erosion of Southern women's patriotism led to the defeat of the Confederacy in 1865. Right? But how curious then that now 150 years after the fact, these are the women that we remember. Right? And that has everything to do more with what happens after the war than what happened sort of during the war. That we remember these women of the South, and memorials exist in every Essex County town, just about, to honor the sacrifices of those loyal men to the Civil War. Right? But we have forgotten those contributions of Northern women. Far from passive observers or hand-wringing mothers and wives waiting for news from the front, many Northern women actively participated in the war effort. By contributing in meaningful ways, these women played a vital role in the Union victory. Essex County women were active in aid societies, they were active as nurses, they were active in the new freedmen's schools, and I hope that our discussion today has brought some of these women's work to light. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has them.
Oh. I think it's only fair to remember that the South also thought that they were fighting for the Union, that the Congress hadn't represented them for over a decade, and they were just claiming the same right to secede as the colonies had.
Right.
And so they had the same,
Yeah. The South uses a very sort of particular revolutionary image, right? In the Confederate seal, they have George Washington on his horse, and that's the centerpiece of the Confederate seal, and he's surrounded by sort of magnolias and tobacco and cotton, right? And they love the image of George Washington because he's the founder of the country. They could link him very specifically to the desire to sort of remove yourself from a government that's not working, which is what they argued they were doing. And he's a slaveholder, so he fits their bill, right? What the South, the part of the revolutionary heritage that the South doesn't talk about are those Enlightenment values, right? The South doesn't want to engage in any sort of discussion about liberty or freedom because that's a pretty problematic discussion to have when you're fighting a war to maintain slavery. So they use this, so they use this very sort of particular version of the Revolutionary War, and they use it cautiously, and they're aware of the way in which kind of broadening that discussion or trying to draw that analogy too extensively is going to turn out to be problematic for them. But yeah, but they do the Southern South Carolina ordinances of secession and other things, point to the Declaration of Independence more than the Constitution. And of course, the Declaration of Independence isn't a lawmaking document, but they point to the sort of ideals of the Declaration as really undergirding their own decision to get out. Of course, Lincoln had been elected, in a vote that the South participated in. So one could poke holes in many of their arguments. Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, you would mention you think of Southern women when you think of the Civil War. Is that kind of part and parcel of that whole lost cause historiography of the late 1800s?
Exactly. So, just as I made the point that as the war's not going well in the midst of the war, right, it's not the men who are going to be, pointed to. It's the women, who are to blame. And in the same way, in the South, when the South suffers defeat, it's a real problem for this entire generation of Southern men. And everybody from ages 14 to 55 is fighting in the Confederacy by the end of the war. And it's a real problem because the South, the old South, the antebellum South, had prided itself on its militarism, right? And they're the ones with the horsemanship, and they're the ones, who, yeah. And so this is a real problem when they have lost the war to kind of, as they would see it, kind of a bunch of immigrant Yankees, right? And so they develop they come up with a sort of very particular way to sort of justify the fact that they lost the war, and really saying that they didn't lose it because of any kind of military deficiencies, but they lost it just because they were outnumbered and sort of resourced, that they were just overwhelmed by the constant Union numbers. And there's some merit to that particular military argument. That sort of germ of an argument sort of expands into this whole sort of lost cause mentality. And there are historians who will argue that if we expand the Civil War to include Reconstruction, right, and we really look at the sort of experience of the Civil War as going until 1877 or beyond, that the South really wins the war because they win the memory of the war. And so that need to defend Southern military valor expands into this lost cause mentality where we have the entire sort of Old South gets lifted up. And this is the Gone with the Wind, or the Shirley Temple kind of vision of the Old South as this sort of genteel aristocracy that is supported by benevolent slavery, right? And that comes crashing tragically to a halt with the Civil War. And the Southern women who stand up to Sherman and who withstand, right? And, the ladies who are reduced to sort of, Scarlett O'Hara never going hungry again, right? Become part of that lost cause ideology. So it's a couple separate things that lost cause is trying to address. One is why the South lost the military battle. The other is, nobody wants to have spent, 300,000 lives on a war to protect slavery and then lose slavery. So another piece of that becomes sort of disavowing slavery as a cause for the war and recreating an image of the Old South that everybody could kind of get behind. And so what we find is very soon after the war, we have sort of Union and Confederate soldiers meeting at battlefields with this sort of hand clasping. We all fought honorably for our beliefs, and just things happen to go our way, and now we move forward. And there's very little remnants of the sort of tension of the war. Very quickly that happens. So that's a long answer to say yes.